This week's interview is with a good friend of mine. I've known him since college, my time at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore. I know, stop me if you heard that before, but I've known Mark DeMorra for close to 20 years. I know sometimes you got to estimate a little up, but it's been close to 20 years. Wouldn't you say so, Mark?
Can you believe how fast time flies like that? 15, 20 years go by now in a snap of your finger. When we were that age, we thought that was an eternity.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing is the older we get, as you mentioned before, time flies. And
time flies as we get older. Back in the day, I always thought a year was like a huge period of time. You're like, what am I going to be doing next year? Now a year is just like, it's next year. It's another birthday. We don't celebrate birthdays as much as we used to. At least I don't think we do.
I think milestone birthdays, after a certain point, you don't try to celebrate them anymore. For me, 40 is going to be the next milestone for me.
Mm-hmm. 40 is going to be the next milestone for both of us. You always tend to have bigger shindigs, and, I always did for birthdays. So, we always go somewhere for your birthday, which is awesome. And so we have fun and we go do stuff. And I think that's great. You have some pocket of the year you look forward to do something fun with your gang, and you enjoy it for what it is.
And you always hold down December and Christmas time, so at least that part's book ended. And I guess New Year's as well. I almost forgot about it. It feels like New Year's is just a continuation of the Christmas holiday.
I mean, it really is, too. So much stuff takes place in that 2-week span. I mean, that's why schools don't even really have class for sometimes 2 or 3 weeks at a time. Like, I wouldn't know about that, right, Earl?
Yeah, I can't think of any other holidays that are so close to each other. Everything's branched out. Everything's bunched out. February, if you count Valentine's Day and you don't count President's Day.
The only one I can think of is that sometimes that government and the schools give you a week off for like Easter, but it's like, and then there's Passover and there's that subset of holidays. And then unless you want to count April Fool's Day, depending on how Easter lands. And that spawns another discussion. There's really no other time of year in which the holidays fall so close together like that, which is why I guess you don't see a lot of outside of Christmas or the holiday stuff. You don't see anything else but during that 2-week period because it's like a marathon of holidays.
Yeah. I feel like with the month of February, you're going to either celebrate one or the other. You're going to either celebrate Valentine's Day and not care about President's Day, or you're going to celebrate President's Day and not care about Valentine's Day.
Yeah, and of course that might be dependent upon if you're single or with somebody, because if you're with somebody, you're going to be more prone to celebrate Valentine's Day. Isn't that right, Earl?
Oh, yeah. Now, you majored in physics, am I right?
You got it. Physics major, minor in mathematics. Can you believe that was 10 years ago? I graduated 10 years ago. Anyhow, proceed.
So you've majored in physics, you minored in mathematics, and you have your MBA as well. That's a very big accomplishment, especially math is such a very tough subject. I was never wired that way. I know some people are wired more towards math and science. Others are towards the arts.
Right. Yeah, it's how your brain is wired. Some people, it's the same thing for like anything. Some people are wired for math and science. Some people are wired for writing and the communications, and that's how your brain is wired. And they're two very distinct sections of the brain. They've done a lot of research on this. And so it's just, again, what we get exposed to as kids, our genetics give us our natural inclination for it. Thank God in my mind, because I enjoy being, math savvy. So yeah, I'm happy that at least my experience, my genetics turned me that way. Just I'm sure you're very happy that it took you towards the broadcast and writing way.
And the thing is, I was exposed to math and science a lot. I can retain the information of certain mathematical and scientific things, but putting them in practice, no way possible.
And that, again, that's just how the brain is wired. And some people are very, very gifted and they can do a little bit of all of it. But, it just boils down to brain development during certain cycles of your youth. So it's interesting. I don't claim to be an expert at it at all, but most of my friends are not as math and science heavy as I am. Most of my friends, as you know, Earl, because we run in the same circles, communications and the artistic side of things. We have a lot of friends who are amazing singers and writers and all that kind of thing. And so I'm kind of the one that sticks out, but I think that's why we all get along. We all have our own clique that we're good at, and we can feed off each other very well.
When I think of people that are very talented in all aspects, I always go back to the comic books and I look at Hank McCoy, Beast in the X-Men. He's a gifted chemist. He knows a lot of physics. He's very good at math. He reads Shakespeare and things like that. That's probably the most accomplished, maybe Lex Luthor as well, but the most accomplished comic book character when it comes to being the most well-rounded.
Or what about Tony Stark? I think of because we're talking about Renaissance people, Renaissance men and women. I think of Tony Stark first myself, but I am not as big of a comic book fan as you are, so I could be very off there.
And that's the thing. I am not as big into comic books. I just watch so much and would read up on a lot of them. I think Tony Stark is definitely a very good businessman.
Scientist.
And he was a good scientist as well. That's where I think Tony Stark has the edge on Bruce Wayne. Bruce Wayne's a very good businessman. Yeah. And I was reading Tony Stark would continuously lose his companies, power plays and things like that. He would start a new company and build one up. I think he's built up like 5 or 6 different companies in the Marvel universe. And anybody who listens, who reads comic books, who's more into it, let me know if I'm close to that number. I might be a little off, but just reading up, he's created a number of different companies after just sort of being kicked out of his company. The opposite of Ted Turner, I guess, in that case.
Yeah, and actually I totally forgot about that point, but you're right. I do remember that he had at least a couple of companies and then lost them. You were talking about the X-Men series and Beast. It made me think of the X-Men cartoon from the 90s. First exposure to X-Men really, and really just comic books. That and Fantastic Four cartoon, Saturday morning. That was really my first exposure to comics in general.
Being exposed to those cartoons gave me a little bit more of a greater appreciation of comic books. And I was so intrigued about trying to find out some of these characters. Like, for example, I assume a lot of people who read comic books, everybody knows that Hank McCoy wasn't always blue and furry. He was human. He just had large hands, large feet. He was human. As a result of a couple of experiments, he had been experimenting around with something, and it would allow him to transform into a furry creature. But he did not get the antidote in time, and he remained like that permanently, and then underwent a couple of different mutations as he went along. One became more cat-like, and then one was more ape-like later on. But Beast is a very interesting, captivating character. He's an adventurer, he's a physicist, he's been on part of a bunch of different groups.
Right. You said big hands. I was laughing earlier. You said big hands because I was thinking about Lana from Archer. And I couldn't, how my mind goes, whoosh. I was thinking about he's a very talented physicist, and we're thinking about if you were to I go from this background, there's this stereotype or whatever, Beast actually, he's a great scientist, but he also was big hands, very, very strong. You think about, he's not the typical physicist. He never was kind of thing. And so, you don't think of a physicist as being in any way athletic or strong or, mighty or quick or anything like that. The X-Men were revolutionary in many ways. They broke stereotypes so much, which was, I think, awesome, which is why I'm glad that it's still running and why people respect it and love it so much.
I honestly lost track of reading a lot of comic books. It feels like with comic books to me, there is so much to read, so little time, so much ground to cover, especially going into a lot of these Marvel movies. I have at least a little bit of a working background, and some of the DC movies as well have a little bit of a working background, a working knowledge of a lot of these characters, because either on Wikipedia reading about these characters or in the library reading all these books about different characters. And now I have a good enough knowledge of some of these characters, but some of these other ones,
there's so many comic book characters. You can't keep track of all of them. To keep track of just one universe is a task. The Marvel universe is massive.
Yeah.
And that's, again, I think that's part of the reason why I didn't so much get into it, because if I'm a fan of something like for James Bond fan, there's the books, there's the movies, there's 20 some odd movies at this point. They're going to be shooting the 25th one here very soon. And it's like, but that's a number I can digest. It's like, this is a concrete, discrete number that's like, okay. But if somebody had never seen James Bond in their life and then wants to get into it, I'm sure they're thinking to themselves, I have 25 movies and like a dozen books just by the original author, and then another how many dozen books by like other authors, and I can't get into that. That's way too much to try to catch up with. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess believe
it's way like sports too.
Is that counting the two unofficial ones?
It counts Never Say Never Again, and that's the only one that counts. It doesn't count Steve's.
And it doesn't count the original Casino Royale?
No.
Okay.
Because what actually happened, we like to talk about business acquisitions and entertainment and all that kind of thing. The company that produced Never Say Never Again, it was released around the same time as in 1983 as Octopussy. And, they called it the Battle of the Bonds. It was Connery versus Roger Moore. And basically what happened is that sometime later in the 90s, Eon, which is, I think, owned by Sony now, Eon produced all the Bond films, ended up getting the rights to that producer and whatever. So it entered canon of James Bond. So that's why now it counts.
But isn't Never Say Never Again basically Thunderball?
It is. Yes, they basically took Thunderball, made a couple of little changes, and it's exactly the same otherwise. Bond's going to the Bahamas looking for a nuclear warhead that his nemesis Blofeld stole and is using as ransom to try to, get power, get money, take over the world. La la la, James Bond. They're the same movie.
Do you think that, I guess in this climate now, a parody of James Bond that's not Get Smart would work? A humorous take on James Bond?
Absolutely, I think it would. And if you want proof of that, just look at Archer. Yeah. Going back to Archer. I mean, if you were to take Archer, and, to me, spoofs are a welcome sight these days. A good spoof. There are so many bad spoofs, and I have to, clarify that. A bad spoof isn't going to do anything for anybody. A good spoof of a film or a genre or something like that is always welcome, I think. A good spoof of James Bond, especially in today's political climate, I think would be great. Something between, James Bond, Britain is sick of, United States and Russia fighting with each other. So they send James Bond over to say, okay, figure out the election or something like that. And then James Bond has to go back and forth and he gets caught in this internal struggle and then has to figure out something. And then, they can leave it open-ended and be like, I guess I never did figure out the original mission. I guess I never did actually accomplish. So
I just thought about it. Two easy spoofs that come to mind. I haven't watched one of them, but of course, Austin Powers. I don't know if that's just more of a parody or a satire. And Johnny English with Rowan Atkinson.
The one thing about Austin Powers, the first two movies, I would say, really got it right. And I think they had a good balance. By the third movie, it was starting to get old. That's the thing about a spoof. You're making fun of the same things over and over again. It's eventually going to get tired. It's going to get tired quicker than an actual just like core idea like film or spy film or like a Mission Impossible film. So the spoof is going to get old. It had run its course by that point. So someone needs to do a new spoof, a new idea, a new character, James Boob or something like that, some new take on the same idea of a spoof of a spy film that I think would still be good, provided who's directing it.
Yeah, I am curious to see what the Johnny English movies are like. I know the next one is coming out. Of course, I haven't seen the first one. When I think of Rowan Atkinson, of course, I think of Mr. Bean.
Yeah, I haven't seen the first Johnny English movie either. I know very little about it, but I know it's supposed to be Bond-ish, for lack of a better term.
Do you think Idris Elba would be a good fit as Bond?
I do. And clarify something. I've read many of the James Bond books. And the basic concept of James Bond is this. He is a British Secret Service agent. And actually, for the movies, they made some adaptations, from the books. Because, of course, in the books, he was very, very chauvinist and violent and just in general a womanizer than he was in the films. And so they did tone it down a little bit. He had a massive scar across his face from a bad incident. So it doesn't actually in the books, as far as I've ever read, clarify that he is what we would call Caucasian. He's British. He's a Secret Service agent. His parents were killed. He lived in a certain spot. So in my mind, you have an actor who can play a spy, so a general actor who looks like a spy, who's tough, who can be quick and handle a gun, has a British accent pretty much, and whether it's, Northern Ireland or whatever, who cares? And they don't look like a wimp. So someone that looks like they could be a spy, could be intimidating, that's James Bond. Details beyond that are what people are reading and are creating in their own mind. It's their imagination going to work, which is great. Every person should be able to have that, but there is no clarification in the books that I've ever seen that says that he is like one particular race or another.
He could be played by an Indian man who is of British descent.
Exactly. Every Indian person I've ever met in my life has black hair. And it does clarify he does have black hair because, the girls like to put their hands through his, wavy black hair, la, 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 la. So, yeah, Idris Elba, I think, would be a fantastic Bond.
I think that's a better idea than some of the stuff they were tossing around a few years ago. Jamie Foxx, Will Smith, which is, I think, they're putting them in there for the sake of putting them in there.
Right. I can't see Will Smith. Jamie Foxx would have to do a damn good British accent to do it, and he'd have to change his overall look. I don't want to say it like this, but there is a little bit, like, I can look at somebody, and this is just me. I think there is a little bit of a difference in how the British conduct themselves, how they walk, facial expressions, all that kind of thing versus. And so I look at Jamie Foxx and it's like, he's not British. He doesn't have those mannerisms. Idris has those mannerisms, or at least he can, I think, realistically duplicate them. I can't see Will Smith or Jamie Foxx being James Bond. If they want them to be a spy, they need to create a spy character for them that's different from James Bond. Same thing that they were going to do with Halle Berry. Do you remember that, Earl?
You might have to refresh my memory on that with Halle Berry.
Halle Berry was going to play a female spy in a series in the James Bond universe. She was Jinx in Die Another Day. Halle Berry, they were talking to about playing in a Jinx movie, basically being a female James Bond. And I thought that idea was awesome because it was 2004 and there was a lot of controversy about whether James Bond was still relevant, you know, all that kind of thing. And that people were clamoring for a female James Bond. And I'm kind of like, just do a female spy akin to Bond. You know, there's no reason why we need to have a character is a character is a character. Instead of just duplicating a character, create a new character. Actually be original, folks. And they were going to make Jinx a female James Bond character, which I liked because I liked Jinx's character in that movie. And I thought that they could really do a lot of fun stuff with her, but it never got off the ground. And I think that was because of Halle Berry's schedule and, you know, the economy was doing some weird stuff at that. I think going through some strikes too. So it never got off the ground, which I think is a shame.
And once you win an Oscar, all of a sudden your value goes up.
You got it. You got it. And that happened as well. She did play Catwoman a few years later. I think that was...
And that was the worst movie and mistake she could have made, but at least she was a good sport and went to the Razzies and accepted her Razzie with a basically dead-on replaying of her Oscar speech.
She looked good in Lycra or whatever that stuff was, too. You know, I think Halle Berry's attractive. So it's like, you know...
And that's another example of how a movie company is not knowing how to do comic books right. And they basically get rid of the essence of what makes a character a character. And I was actually just sitting up recently watching a critique of Batman versus Superman. It's like a 3-hour critique of the movie. That's probably the same length of the movie with the extra cut. And they just talked about how we took all the characters, all the things that made the characters these characters. And if you're trying to do a deconstruction of them, they didn't do it well.
What was the name of the director? I forget his name. He's done so many.
Zack Snyder. He's done...
Zack Snyder, that's
Watchmen.
it.
He's done Sucker Punch. He's done 300.
Has Zack Snyder done a faithful comic book movie? Because the ones that I know he's directed that I've seen, I've been like, this doesn't seem like what I've always thought of these characters. It always seems like that he's like too edgy, too gritty, too like serious, you know, that kind of thing. What do you think?
Looking at it, it seems like a lot of his comic books, movies, a lot of them are based off Frank Miller books, graphic novels, and things like that. And again, I didn't read 300. I never read a lot of the Batman stuff, the Dark Knight. Again, a lot of my memories sort of blinking on this, and I was sort of looking that up. But I haven't read a lot of these stuff. I had a copy of Watchmen that a friend of mine gave me, and I haven't read it, but after seeing the movie, I mean, I don't know if trying to read the book after seeing the movie is a good thing, or reading the book and then seeing the movie. There's going to be so many things that are going to be changed from the source content that it'll drive you nuts. That's why, for example, X-Men First Class. It was a really good movie, probably one of the better X-Men movies as of late. But I was sort of dead set against watching it because it didn't have the original 5 X-Men the way the story should have been told. Yeah, they made it better, but I don't know. Just sort of one of those old man yells at cloud type things, which, again, that was an incident where I was, not even in my 30s yet. And I was like, if it ain't Beast, Angel, Iceman, Cyclops, and Jean Grey, I'm not down for it. But I still watched it anyway.
And you had a nostalgic piece to that. And so you were a little more purist on that one than you might have been on some of the other things. And again, that just tunes into what your experiences are with it. It'd be like if somebody were to try to create a new Back to the Future movie and then Mark is like, why isn't there like Doc, or why is it some new scientist? You know, I'm not going to watch a Back to the Future that doesn't have Doc and Marty, right? You know?
Yeah. And I think the biggest thing is, I think Robert Zemeckis, for example, made it, I think him and Bob Gale, I think made it known that it will not be able to be remade in their lifetime. It bequeathed in their will. It will not be remade at all, I think. And those are things, they are very protective of that.
Right. And of all the remakes that they made remakes of seeming almost everything at this point. I thought that if I tried it, I mean, they did try some Back to the Future-esque type movies. Like, I think one was called Time Splitters or something like that, or Time Jumpers or something like that about 10 years ago. But yeah, Zemeckis and Gale both were like, you will not touch this movie. And I heard that, I was, a part of me, I guess it was a part of my childhood that went like, oh, thank you, God. Because, I mean, to this day, I mean, actually, like you said, I work for the University of Maryland, and I do grants for college students and kids as young as 5 sometimes. A lot of them have seen the movie series. A lot of them haven't. It's probably about 50-50. The ones that have seen it have said that they liked it for the most part. The ones that haven't seen it when they see it, they love it. And they think that, you know, and when I tell them, when their grandfather or their father or whoever, you know, is with me and talk to them about these things, tell them that it was made, you know, 3 years ago, they're like, what? You mean it's older than Mr. Mark? And they're like, yeah, it is. And then there runs the joke, oh, that's old then. Yeah, shut up, you little brat. But in the same breath, I also have, you know, very special type of group kids in my program, very sciencey, techie, mathy type kids too. So their interpretations of things are going to be very different. They're going to be ones that are going to be more prone to like the comic books as well, and, you know, Back to the Future and old stuff. And actually, that gets into another thing. You and I are both classic TV fans. A lot of the kids that I have in my programs now, they like watching things like MeTV. Andy Griffith is apparently particularly a favorite among them, of all things. And I'm like, seriously? I like Andy Griffith, but, you know, I like old stuff like that. So I thought that was very interesting. Have you seen anything like that in your experience?
I think with the advent, of course, these channels like MeTV and Cozy TV, and of course Hulu and Netflix holding on to these libraries, and CBS All Access, and a lot of these things holding on to these historical bits of TV shows, Bounce TV, things like that. It's interesting to see someone who's never seen a show before, what it's like, an older show, especially from out of their age range, and looking at it, something that would have been like taboo at the time a show came out, is like basically old hat now. Yeah. Look at
I Love Lucy was a great example of that.
Oh yeah,
Soap is a great example of that.
Living in New York City,
pregnant, had a baby, you know, on TV basically, you know, they showed it at a point. I think for Lucy and Ricky, the first TV couple to actually sleep in the same bed. Yeah. They started separate. I remember that. I think they were the first couple. I mean, they broke ground so much. But as you said, nowadays, it's whatever. It's old hat. You know, who cares?
And especially what made it interesting is that Lucy and Desi owned their own production company.
Yeah. And Desi Blue was a magnificently successful production company. They produced so many big hits through the 70s. I mean, they were massive. You know, Desi and Lucy, I don't have any worse swerve, you know, towards the end of their lives, but I can't imagine it wasn't anything less than hundreds of millions of dollars.
Oh yeah, then them selling it to Paramount too, and then they were the ones that put Star Trek on.
Yes, I mean, can you imagine that Lucille Ball is responsible for Star Trek, which a lot of people say is what inspired Star Wars. So does that mean that without Lucille Ball, there'd be no Star Wars?
I wouldn't say that, because from what it was said, George Lucas wanted to do a Flash Gordon movie. They could not secure the rights. And that's when he started with Star Wars.
You haven't heard that? Like, I've heard that Star Trek was one of the inspirations for Star Wars.
Yeah, I think maybe when you look at the episodes 1, 2, and 3, a little more diplomatic and all that stuff. But even then, there's like really slow pacing. And I still have not seen a Phantom Menace in whole. I have not seen the whole movie.
I haven't either.
I've really only seen the fight with Obi-Wan, Qui-Gon, and Darth Maul. Other than that, I can sort of do without it.
I've only seen the second and third ones in full. I mean, outside of the original series. Yeah, I've only seen bits and pieces of the first because it didn't have any sort of appeal to me. Despite, you know, again, one of the funny things about, you know, you said my degree's in physics. My specialty is in astronomy, astrophysics. Star Wars and Star Trek were not the movies I grew up with. They were there. I respected them, I know, but I was not a particular fan of them. I didn't hate them. I was just not a particular fan of them. You know, it was Back to the Future was my inspirational movie. And a lot of people are like shocked by that kind of thing. What was your inspirational movie, Earl? I know you're supposed to be asking me the questions, but I'm going to ask you some questions, Earl.
Yeah. And when it comes to inspirational movies, it is a very tough question to answer. Because I have a lot of favorite movies, but none of them that really inspired, to be honest.
You had inspirational TV shows.
And that's a little tough, too. Because I feel like consuming years and years of consuming TV shows, there's nothing really that stood out to me. I have a bunch of favorites, but nothing that's like, wow, this made me get into writing. This made me get into wanting to be in sports. This got me into radio. None of those.
You told me the Big Green didn't just absolutely knock your socks off when it came off. Do you remember that movie?
Sports movies, that's down the hierarchy. As I've mentioned in the past, I have a lot of favorite sports movies. The Major Leagues 1 and 2 are good. Number 3 is dead to me, and I don't care about it. I like Rookie of the Year.
Okay.
Sandlot is good. Yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to my hierarchy of sports movies. Yeah, there's a bunch of cheesy ones like The Sixth Man and Yeah, that might be it. I mean, I've seen a lot of sports movies, but none of them that were like super inspirational.
The Sixth Man?
It is with Marlon Wayans and Kadeem Hardison. Mm-hmm. And Kadeem Hardison is the star basketball player on the team, and Marlon Wayans is his younger brother. Mm-hmm. So, during a game, Kadeem Hardison's character goes up for a slam dunk, and he has a heart attack. So he dies. And basically, the team, through his ghost, having a successful run in the tournament. Yeah. I am not kidding.
What year did this come out?
Oh, man.
The Sixth Man.
Yes.
I get the reference now.
Off the bench, the sixth man off the bench.
Oh, okay. My mind never would have went there unless you explained that to me. Wow.
1997.
Okay. For about 14. You were older than that. You were like 16 at that time. 16, 17, right?
About 14. Yeah, about 14 there.
You were about 14. Okay, I had it right the first time. So that's interesting. That was early on, I guess. Well, relatively early in the Wayans careers at that point.
Well, you have the second generation of Wayans, I guess, in that case.
True. Mm-hmm. That middle 90s period. Mm-hmm. But you didn't have any real, like, inspirational sports movies, I guess, then, did you?
Nah, I can't say stuff like Rudy or anything like that were inspirational to me, but...
I would have thought there was. That's why it's like I never had asked you that question before. That's why I was like, that's interesting.
Not a lot of fictional stuff drew me into pursuing a particular career in a particular avenue.
Mm-hmm. Everyone has a different background, and everything that we get exposed to leads us towards something. I would think, if you're, if you're into destiny, all that kind of thing, it leads us to our destiny.
Fate, destiny, however you want to, kismet, whatever you want to call it.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That's a term that doesn't get thrown out a lot anymore, kismet.
Kismet?
Yeah, that term doesn't seem like it's thrown out anymore.
I've heard the term. What does it exactly refer to, though?
It is a synonym to fate and destiny.
Okay. The password is Kismet. There we go.
Yeah, it's a term I don't hear a lot anymore. It was sort of like swagger. You didn't really hear that anymore until it was brought back and beaten into the ground.
Beating a dead swagger.
Sometimes it's nice to use a word that hasn't been used in years as a way to sort of like enhance a sentence and sort of show off the quasi-intellectual side of some people with a term that hasn't been used.
You got it.
To a period where the term swagger became as annoying as on fleek.
Oh, God. Fleek.
On fleek.
I was so very early. I heard that so much. But again, I was starting to work with college kids around that time too. So, of course, every time something like that happens, the first ones that grab on it are kids. They'll grab on it and they'll just run them into the ground. Minecraft was, new. Everyone played Minecraft. Everyone cited Minecraft. Same thing with Fortnite now. I mean, kids are the first ones that if there's something you're remotely trending, they'll latch onto and then they'll go to the ones that beat it into the ground. Heck, if I hear some kid talking about how much they love Cardi B again, that's all I'm going to do. Not going to be like, Cardi B was as original as a punch in your face kind of thing. And that's nothing against Cardi B, but, I'm just like, we've talked about our preferences in music, and you and I are on relatively the same page, Earl. There's no original music anymore either.
Yeah, and I'm going to discuss this with as many people as I talk to when it comes to the subject of music. Now, I'll say maybe a range, maybe from the 50s, maybe to the early 2000s.
Mm-hmm.
Particular bands and artists had a particular style that if you knew a song came on the radio, you knew this was Chicago. This was the Isley Brothers. This was Phil Collins. This was Whitney Houston. This was Michael Jackson. This was some other band. Now everything sounds so homogeneous. When country songs are starting to sound like R&B songs.
Mm-hmm. Or rock, whichever one, if it's even going to be called rock.
Yeah. And I am not anti-pop music. None. No. Whatsoever. That'd be hypocritical, liking Michael Jackson, liking all these other things.
Right.
Pop's going to happen. But now rap is they've experimented so much with so many different things. It's just hard to even listen to or understand. And I hate being that person, especially at 35, to feel like, oh, rap is just garbage. I'm not talking about the rappers. Yeah, there may be some rappers out there who know their lyrics, who are good, but just sometimes you just don't like wade through all the crap to find something, which is a lazy way of saying stuff.
Rapping is a talent, and it's a talent I think that very few people are actually good at. again, how the brain is wired. You have to be able to come up with like jingly, catchy, rhyming words that, themes very, very quickly as you're improvising, going along. Rapping is a talent. And I think very, very few people in general are good at it. And these days, the ones that are actually good at it are ones that were not getting exposed because the people that have been around for a while or just look pretty and might be mildly just aren't bad at it are the ones that are like putting record deals and that kind of thing. I don't know of any real people who are in the rap game that are like I think of are particularly good. I don't think 50 Cent's released anything in a while.
I haven't really listened to a lot of Drake stuff, and
Drake doesn't impress me, honestly, but that's just me. I'm sure people would disagree the heck out of me.
There was this stage when a lot of people, and I yield to call a lot of them maybe a tad bit hipsterish, but Lil Wayne, I was never a fan of his. There were probably plenty of other rappers that were better rappers than Lil Wayne. Just even some of his lyrical content was just awful. And I'm not going to say that I am a student of the game of rap. I'm not. But honestly, just listening to some of the lyrics, they're just so nonsensical and stupid.
It's so much of it is nonsensical. That's the problem. I mean, it's like if you are a student of classic, you actually know that rap up until, like you said, like the early 2000s, yeah, you might have lots of vulgar language, but there actually was something that was being discussed. There was something going on. There was some content or some story that was being explained there. It wasn't just them throwing together random words and inserting a cuss word here and there or some euphemism for something. That's, nail on the head there, in my opinion.
Actually, and I think the euphemisms sometimes were better than just being out and out. And I don't want euphemisms to be compared to political correctness. That's a far different thing within itself.
Very far. But you think about also how much we use euphemisms and how much they have, Match Game, for example, is a show that's pretty much built off the idea of a euphemism, at least the one that everybody remembers, euphemisms and little slight winks and all that kind of thing,
Yeah, and I think at that time, the early 70s, and we were going to get on the game shows anyway, but I would just find a good hard segue into game shows. But yeah, look at Match Game. Again, the network's a little tighter on censorship, certain things you could and couldn't say.
Mm-hmm. There was this explicit rule with Match Game that, it happened a couple of times, but you're not supposed to say any sort of word or synonym or euphemism for genitalia on there. By the way, sorry we're talking about this, but that was an explicit rule on there. And so the celebrities had to find ways to dodge all that stuff.
And that's another thing. Now things seem a little looser, but there's still a fine line of what you can and can't say on TV.
Mm-hmm. Do you like the current Match Game?
I like it, but my only gripe is this. If there's a word that is being censored or pixelated out on the card, you should at least be able to know what the word is. For example, they could do like a Match Game uncensored that you can do maybe on the internet.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that.
That way you let the words be known, because some of the answers you don't even know what they're saying, because not only do they cover up the word and they pixelate the word out, they cover up the mouth of the person. So it's not even like they mute it. Mm-hmm. They just basically cover it up and you can't tell what they're going to say.
I'm actually surprised because it's like what these days hasn't, I hate to say it like this, what these days has not been said on television that they're saying. I don't know what hasn't been said. So what are they trying to do? Are they trying to promote not to say that Match Game is a clean show, but it's like they're saying we're not quite that dirty. We're a certain level of clean or something like that. It's very strange to me, that they're actually really even censoring anything on there anymore. Because if you're really going to be writing an answer that could be censored, then it's like, okay, why are you writing the question at all then? If you're not looking for that answer, then why are you writing that question? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think nowadays, going back to if you go with George Carlin's 7 words, really, 2 of them are said more on TV, but the other 5 are still no-goes.
And that's the thing. I feel like that there's been some instance I've seen them on TV, but, I could be wrong. It might have been a movie or something that I saw them or whatever. But I just feel like, that one of the things about modern television that there's I don't want to say that there's no rules, but there's very, very little that's not allowed anymore. Obviously, nudity is not allowed, but.
And network TV, some is. NYPD Blue.
Right.
And shows like that sort of broke the mold, but it's nothing frontal.
Right. And when you think about Game of Thrones, it's like if you technically call that television on HBO or those premium channels, there almost is no lines anymore. I'm not criticizing it or saying good or bad or different. I'm just saying that it's interesting to me that some shows still choose to censor certain things and they do others. And then at the end of the day, because I don't envision, match game is pretty popular now again. I don't envision, kids watching match game. If they're going to be watching any game show, they're going to be watching Family Feud, and if they're home from school, they're watching Price is Right and Let's Make a Deal, Wheel, or unless they're very, very young. And I don't watch them in, envision them watching Jeopardy unless they're in like high school or college. So outside of that, if they're watching any game show at all, it's going to be Feud. It's not going to be match game. And
as we transition to one of the topics I wanted to talk about, game shows as well, I feel like that is a form of competition.
Yes.
And competition, that's a good question. What type of competition can be considered a sport?
There's a line between like what one might call a competition and what one might call an actual sport. You're right.
ESPN, for example, had for years, and they still do, maybe not as much prominence as it was a few years ago, poker. Poker was definitely on ESPN a lot.
Oh, yeah. That 2004 and 2008 time period, my God. You can find poker on at least a few hours every single day.
And then, of course, every year they do the spelling bee. As someone who is not into spelling, but more into trivia, I don't see how you can't have a trivia competition on ESPN.
Right. If you're going to have a spelling bee, if you're going to be saying that that's okay at the line, and I don't see how like Quiz Bowl, College Bowl are in that same, I agree with you there. Because it's the same idea. You're testing the knowledge of somebody via some quiz or questionnaire in some form. Yeah.
And at one point, ESPN, before they got all those big contracts to show all the major sports, they would have tractor pulls. They would air professional wrestling. They would air all different types of things.
Do you think a tractor pull is a sport?
No, I don't think tractor pull is a sport. I don't.
I don't think it is either. And I mean, I'm not knocking tractor pulling. It's just that, that's actually what I think the basic question here. How does one define a sport? I define a sport as a competition in some form which involves a degree of physical activity. How would you define a sport?
The easiest way would be going by the textbook answer, athletic competition. But that case, if spelling is on there, why isn't chess?
Correct. I agree.
And none of those are easy for your average fan that watches ESPN.
No.
Spelling isn't any easier even if you put the word up there.
I don't think we either consider ourselves big chess experts, but we know that chess is mentally taxing. Heck, depending on the game, a game of checkers or backgammon could be mentally taxing depending on who you are. But I'm not going to consider them. I don't consider them a sport so much, but maybe that's just me,
Yeah, I feel like sports, the athletic part, game shows are the mental part. Unless, for example, something like Double Dare or something where you actually physically involved. And then there's reality shows, which if you take all the fabricated portions of it out,
and there's a lot.
There might be a portion that's still maybe either it could be part sport, part athletic competition, part game show.
And at the end of the day, then you start to talk about the difference between like game shows and reality shows, or not necessarily a game show kind of thing. So in my mind, it was always like a Survivor is a reality show. Big Brother is a reality show. Wheel of Fortune's a game show. And my always distinguishing factor is that there's a game, but a reality show puts them into situations and it takes place over a season, while a game show, in theory, is completed on one episode kind of thing.
Yeah. And again, I haven't watched Big Brother or Survivor, so I really doubt that they have maybe like the intellectual type challenges that they used to have. I remember the first season of Big Brother, they had a competition where the teams had to pick out which celebrity is alive or dead. If they're asked for a particular celebrity, you have to say alive.
Oh, yeah. Big Brother doesn't do that anymore. I stopped watching Big Brother years ago, started getting away from that. And that's when they started focusing solely on the drama between like the people and all that kind of thing. And there's always drama, but I always used to like the plotting, when they would interview the players and they would talk about what they're plotting to do in order to basically upend the house or, form an alliance, vote against this person. That's the strategy part. And that's the part of it I liked. And I think it was probably like 10 or 11 years ago I stopped watching. They started getting away from that, just focusing on like them, just fighting with each other all the time. And then, all the rest. They don't do the actual game strategy part of it anymore that I used to like. Survivor and Amazing Race, I think are the only ones I'd ever watch at all anymore. I never really watched Survivor much at all.
Could we say, for an example, Scrabble is a game, but Spelling Bee isn't a game?
Yes. As in, like, a spelling bee is not a game in general.
Yeah. The board game Scrabble, which already has it in its name, board game, it's competition, yes, but it is not a game.
Yeah. That's a good question. Because I'm thinking about spelling bee, and it's like, okay, then you have to define what a game is. And then it's like, okay, are you defining a game as in like what a lay person would define as a game, or what do you would define a game mathematically? And I'm not even going to go into the mathematical side of it. We'll be here all day. But that's interesting. Spelling bee, is a spelling bee a game? Ooh, I feel like spelling bee has a winner. You know, there's an objective. There isn't really actually a strategy to a spelling bee, you know? You know it or you don't. You know how to spell something or you don't. It's not like it's words to spell.
It's not like where, I'll pass this word to someone else to see if they spell it. Yeah, you don't have the advantage. You just have to get the luck of the draw. Jeopardy
actually has strategy, and that's why it's a game. But then that brings up a question, is like a trivia contest, is that a game then?
Yeah, that's a big question. I don't know. It's competition. I feel like when it comes to certain things, you have to put it in an example of category A, it's a sport. Category B, it's a game. Category C, it's a competition.
Yep.
Sometimes those things intersect with each other. Some will be a sport and a competition. Other times it'll be a game and a sport. Other times it's a game and a competition. But rarely do you have one that's all three.
Let's start at the very basic level. Arm wrestling. Arm wrestling, a sport, a game, or a competition? I think of arm wrestling as a sport because it is competitive with a physical element to it. What do you think?
A sport and a competition. It's a physical thing.
Now then, if you take away, let's say, the money, and if you take away the television element out of it, what is deal or no deal? Is it a game? Is it a competition?
It's a game because you're not playing against anybody.
Right.
That's a game. I feel like you can play games games can be competitive too. But if you're just playing against sheer luck.
Because solitaire is a game. You play it with yourself.
Yeah.
It's not a sport. It's a game.
Yeah.
It's not a competition, though. It's a game. And then if we were to say, okay, if I'm playing hangman or somebody, you know, that game, it's not a sport, of course. But let's say then if we put the two of us on stage and in front of an audience, there weren't any prizes, but let's say they were asking us to play hangman against each other. It would be a game, it'd be a competition, you know, and all that kind of thing. So where I'm going is when it comes to like spelling bees, I actually think it's a game because I could play a game with myself. You know, I have Siri, for example, or some method by which I get a word or somebody says a word and then I have to spell it. You know, it's a game in that case against myself. A spelling bee then would be a competition with the spelling game in it. So that's where I was going with all that, is that I'm trying to piece together. It's like if we're considering that a game, or we're considering that a game or competition. And by that, I think that a spelling bee would have to actually be considered a game. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, the competition part of it. Yeah, you're facing other people, but there's no strategy to it. It's being lucky if you get the word right or not.
And so that's the thing, because I don't consider it to be any strategy to deal or no deal. It's luck.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
so did you consider
luck? Certain things involve competition, knowledge, strategy.
Now, the one thing is, were you a big solitaire player? Did you ever play a lot of solitaire?
I played solitaire on the computer. I'm not a really big fan of it.
You mentioned poker earlier. I played a lot of cards in my time. There are a few versions of solitaire that are pretty much solely luck-based. For example, pyramid solitaire is basically, you know, you form a pyramid of cards, and then you have your deck, and then you draw a card, have to basically match it up with the one in which totals 13 points. You know, I don't see how that could be strategy, but it's considered solitaire, and it's still a game, but at the end of the day, I can't control what card gets drawn because it's shuffled. So I still consider it a game, but the strategy there is pretty much non-existent. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get you with that. And as a poker player, well, what is your experience of playing poker? How did you get into playing poker, and what are some of the strategies aspects of the game, and what would you classify it as? Is it a combination of game and competition? Is it sport and competition, sport and game? Rarely is there something that's all three, and I can't even figure that out. Like, except maybe American Gladiators, maybe. That might be reaching.
Yeah, so you know me, Earl. I love games in general, whether it be card games, board games, game shows, you know, all that kind of thing. I've never been an athlete in any real form. I played soccer for a long time when I was in school, but I am not a natural born athlete. My dad is. My dad, is in his 60s and still referees soccer. So, but I grew up in a very game-oriented atmosphere. We played a lot of games. My dad, a lot of cards, Monopoly. We played a little bit of poker. Our favorite game to play together is actually backgammon. We just haven't played it in a long time. So I always liked to play cards. I played poker, played gin, all that kind of things, which has very similar components to it. You're trying to make the best hand. Here are your sets of different types of hands. But I really didn't get involved in, I would say, the Texas Hold'em thing. I didn't even know that Texas Hold'em was a type of poker until it became popular. My dad was actually watching these, like, they're showing poker on ESPN. And I'm like, what? I don't watch ESPN. Of course he does quite a bit. But we started watching it. We just were looking and we were observing and we're like, this is interesting. There are these, we know that there are expert poker players and, that the ones that do really well are millionaires and make a lot of money every year, but those are few and far between. And we're watching and it's like, we're strangely intrigued. It's like, what would you wish? And that's the whole idea. That's why it almost went into game show territory to me, because I'm putting myself in the perspective of a contestant or a poker player. And it's like, hey, I wouldn't have done that. Why did you do that? Why did you have two aces, and then fold? For example, so that's what got me into it. It was right around 2004 or 5. The thing that I also realized that a lot of people there, they played their instincts instead of playing the odds. Now, at the end of the day, instinct in luck is such a huge part of that version of poker. There are some poker versions that are just Texas Hold'em is about 50% luck and 50% skill. You can be the most skilled poker, Texas Hold'em player in the world and still lose if you just don't get the cards. And some, I argue, oh, well, you don't need the cards. Well, guess what? If I'm getting 7 deuce every single hand for the entire day, or if I'm not pairing up anything, I don't care how good I am. I'm not going to be able to get any money because somebody will eventually call me and I will lose my money. You can only do so much with so little. So Texas Hold'em is very, very luck intensive. It's one of the most luck dependent versions of poker, but it was still fascinating playing it. And I've been in some competitions, and my general strategy is to follow the odds, at least at first. If I'm in a tournament and, and that's the thing, you play a Texas Hold'em tournament very differently if there's only, like, say, 9 or 10 of you versus if there's a few hundred of you, or God forbid, a few thousand of you. If you're trying to stay alive in a tournament that has lots of people, your strategy is to just basically wing it, to try to stay stable with a certain number of chips. Figure out how many chips you're going to need to be able to move on and hopefully end in the money. Because I don't want to say that almost anybody, or at least very, very few, that go into a tournament that has lots of people like that expects that they are going to win. They are going to be happy if they end in the money, unless they're a pro. If they're a pro, then they might expect to win. When I was in a tournament, I was happy if I ended in the money. I had to purchase my buy-in and then all that kind of thing. So if I ended up getting my money back and getting a little something more, I would be happy because it was worth my time and I had some fun in the process. But my general strategy was at first to follow the odds and basically play the cards I get and not really take a lot of risks, which is dependent upon, of course, I get at least a card now and then. So if I had at least, for example, early on, I would be trying to see if it gave me anything. If it didn't, I'd probably be getting out of there as soon as possible. If I did have something, I would try to milk it as much as it'd be worth. If I felt really strong, I'd hold back and see if anyone else felt strong. And if somebody did, I'd try to undercut them and be like, yeah, I just had a little something, and hopefully turn over a full house and then be like, shit, I had no idea. That's the whole concept behind bluffing. I'm not going to add anything until, you give me reason to believe otherwise. So my whole idea early on, I don't think to be a good bluffer, and actually that's why poker exploded, because the people who weren't good bluffers never would enter poker tournaments. Then they saw Chris Moneymaker and a whole bunch of other people starting to wear glasses and hats and all this kind of thing to cover their emotions. And they're like, oh, if I can do that, then I can play poker. And then they'd be bluffing all the time, and half their tells would be gone. Biggest tell in poker. And so you cover your eyes. Suddenly, if you're one of those people that they have a tick or something like that when they're lying, or they get their eyes wince or whatever, or their pupils dilate or whatever, you're not going to be able to see that if they're wearing sunglasses. And so Chris Moneymaker was one of the first ones which became popular. Poker players have been doing it for years, but he was one of the first ones that really put it out there. And he was not a pro. He was brand new in 2004. He entered it and he won, and it shocked, the entire community. But that's my general concept, is that I play it pretty close to the vest at first. And if I feel like if I sense weakness in somebody, and you can't sense weakness. And that's the thing. Some players say they can sense weakness right as the person sits down and that kind of thing. I'm like, no, you're full of shit. I have to observe somebody for a while. You can only sense patterns after a certain amount of time. And this again goes back to physics. I can't establish a pattern if something happens only once. It has to happen multiple times for me to be like, yeah, that's a pattern. I can exploit that pattern, and that's how I'm going to get money off that person.
The only problem is that you need enough time and enough information to know, unless you have spies watching every person and every
I have James Bonds behind me. Yeah, that's right. You're exactly right.
And that's movement, or like if you go by the show Elementary, where Sherlock is just so good at noticing certain ticks and movements and actions where you'd be able to take advantage of them on just meeting them at first sight. There's no way you can tell.
Right. And that's exactly right. You need a certain amount of time in order to establish these patterns and then figure out how to exploit them. And that's always if you had a table in which you're at with a bunch of pros, guess what? You're not going to get any information off them. You're basically going to have to take risks, hope you get the cards, hope somebody believes you, and that's how you move on. And that's why I say that poker is 50% luck. It's outside of the cards. It's so much luck that it's like, no matter how good you are, if you just have an unlucky day, there's no way you're going to win. You need both the skill and the luck in like a Texas Hold'em game. So you have to have enough time in order to establish a pattern, provided that there's any patterns to establish. If there's no patterns to establish, then it's just a random draw, and you might as well just be as random in your play. That was always my thing. I don't claim to be an expert poker player. I won a couple of times, but I didn't win enough that I think I'd be myself playing poker. And I had some times which it was absolutely terrible luck. Remember when poker was really big online, and there was all sorts of websites where you could play, and you would go on and you'd have like a custom character, and then you'd be dealt a card. You can enter tournaments or free play. This was probably like 5-6 years ago at this point. Poker Stars is the first one that comes to mind. They were advertising them all the time on ESPN. Did you ever play poker much?
Never a lot of Texas Hold'em. I mean, I played like the generic 5 or 7 card draw.
So I went about 5-6 years ago. No, it was longer than that. Probably closer to 10 years ago too now. I used to be on a couple of those sites, and I would play quite a bit. And I just always remember I could get great cards. Obviously, I tried to, I'd have to measure the table. Sometimes I'd play it slow. Sometimes I'd play it hard, depending upon how gullible or how not. There were some people on those websites, no matter what they'd had, they'd be going all in each time. And then, they'd go in with like a 2 and a 3, and they'd end up winning because of luck of the draw. And then they'd keep doing that, and then they'd somehow keep winning. And then there'd be accusations of cheating and all that kind of, someone rigged the program, all that kind of thing. And then there would be times, same person, I had double aces. I remember one time, I think on the flop, I had what they call quad aces, which is 4 of a kind aces. It's one of those dream hands that there's basically only 2 things that'll beat you. If you had 4 aces, you could get a straight flush, or you can get the primo version of a straight flush, the royal flush. Mm-hmm. Those are the only things that beat you if you have 4 aces. I had 4 aces. The guy that had been all this time, he played a 3-5, I want to say spades. I remember being spades, because I remember it was very appropriate. He rivered a straight flush and knocked me out. What am I going to do with quad aces? What am I not going to go all in? Especially when this guy across the table has been, going all in every hand and somehow winning, with terrible hands. Like, I have quad aces. There's no way that you beat me at this. Holy shit, you beat me. What else am I going to do with quad aces? That's always the thing about poker. It's like, I played that hand as by the book, by anybody's book that's ever been written, should have been played, and I still lost. And that's how poker works. You just got to accept you will lose, and you got to hope that the times that you win are big enough that counter the times that you lose. And I want to say the odds for having quad ace is something like 1 in 500,000, if not more. So he pulled that 1 in 500,000 odd to beat me on that. And I got knocked out of that tournament and that was one of those big ones. It was a 4,000 person online tournament, and we were at the final 2 tables, and guess what? Yeah, he pulls that on me, and I didn't play poker for at least a couple of weeks because I was so ticked off. It's like, you don't deserve this. It's like, I played the correctly cards. You didn't deserve that. Oh, I was sick. I had a bad beat. And I was fuming pretty badly from it. That's how poker works. And that's how most card games work in general. So, yeah, you just got to kind of hope that if you decide to go into card games, and I don't encourage going to gambling as a full-time thing. Number one, you got to know the odds. You got to know the math behind it. Because I make the analogy to blackjack, too. I think I've told you I play blackjack quite a bit now. And that, when we go to a casino, Mark stays away from poker. Mark plays blackjack. And do you remember why Mark plays blackjack, Earl?
Because of your math skills, probably.
If you know the math, Jack, it is the only game in the casino which you can have the advantage over the dealer. Which the percentile, if you play it by the odds, would be in your favor slightly over the dealer. Instead of being like 40% to 60%, if you know the odds and you know the math behind blackjack and you're paying attention to cards, you can have a 51, 52 percentile. It is the only game you can do that. And it's why it's the only game I play in a casino. It's also why it's the only game in a casino I've ever won. I've ever won money at, really, over time. You have to know the math. You have to know the theory behind it. You have to know the odds if you're going to go into it. There's no other way around it. You can't just rely and say, I'm a lucky person, I'm going to do it. It's not going to happen. You have to know the math. And that's probability and statistics and all that kind of thing.
Speaking of probability, statistics, luck, and other things, I'm a big fan of baseball. And baseball is a sport basically of failure. You can fail 70% of the time and still be the greatest in your sport.
Mm-hmm. How few people have, batting averages over 300, right?
Yeah, and that seems like that has gone down in years as well.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the things, of course, I wanted to talk to you about, because numbers and math and statistics would be a little more your forte, is, and we've had this discussion before, sabermetrics, advanced statistics, things like that. While they seem like they're a lot of the same, they are not the exact same thing. They are very different just by going by some of the different textbook definitions of advanced statistics and sabermetrics. And to me, I know there's been more of a focus in the sport. I feel that statistics are starting to go a little more hand in hand with the scouting aspect of baseball. Not only can you see, do they have the ability to do particular things, it's what particular statistic shows what they're strong at. Like some guys walk more. Some guys hit the ball harder. Some guys are faster. Yeah. And especially the way they scout guys, they have their scales. The lowest you can have, it's on a 20 to 80 scale. 80 is at the utmost and 20 is as low as you can get. Guys try to project what a guy could be in the future. And some of those things you can't really project because you don't know what's going on in their personal life.
Exactly.
Injury can throw everything off, and performance too. Performance can overrule anything. Some guys that you wouldn't even given a chance can end up performing at an optimal level to the point where any projection that you have for them or any eye test that you have for them is really negated.
Right, and that's actually one of the key differences between doing statistics for something like what we were talking about earlier, like a poker game or like a game show, where the rules are very rigid and there's basically win, loss, and there's very few elements. In a sport, in at least, for example, baseball, it's an athletic sport. There are so many factors that can go into how an athlete performs that day. And at least right now, and I don't think ever in our lifetime, there's no way to quantify every single element of an athlete's performance in a particular game. It's trying to quantify every possible motion and movement and ability of the body on that particular day. And of course, some people just sleep wrong, and the next day, their entire body mechanism is different. They kink something, or their back hurts a little bit or something, and that's going to affect how they play. It's very difficult to do statistics for baseball and be able to, I think, forecast future performance, which is why sabermetrics was brought up in the first place, to find more accurate means with which to judge how athletes perform and predict which ones are going to have the most success going forward. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, and the thing is that no one can predict an early decline.
Yes.
And the biggest thing is, when it comes to baseball players, their peak is about the ages 26 to 30.
Yeah.
And that's why you see a lot of guys, for example, Manny Machado, he just turned 26. He's put up a lot of numbers from age 20 to 26. And a lot of these guys will get paid for past performance, not exactly what they're going to do.
Right. And some people peak before they're 26 because of medical things that might happen, or because, something that happened in their own personal lives. Like, for example, I think there is probably some tendency for, like, we're talking about genetics, for example, just for a second, chronic illness. There's a huge increase in the amount of chronic illness in people these days. And we've talked about that before with people we know, families and ourselves and everything. If a person, they're in their 20s, you're supposed to be your most virile and powerful and all that kind of thing. But if that's also when, for example, you develop a chronic illness, like you end up having early stage arthritis or disease, or name a chronic illness, and that ends up developing early on because it developed early on in your father, guess what? If I was an athlete, first of all, I would not be putting that out there. That's my family has a history of chronic illness, because guess what? I know I'm not going to be offered my contract, right? If there's some tendency that Mark's probably going to get sick, in 5 or 6 years, no, I'm not going to tell my coach that, because guess what? It means I'm probably going to be less playing because Mark's health's going to fail, and then he's suddenly not going to be able to play. But then, it hits. And so they have their peak in their early 20s, and then they get signed until something, like you said, for 5, 6 years. But then, bam, they get nailed with some ailment, or God forbid, they might break something or tear something that ends up affecting their ability just, in its recovery, about them, just the body to heal fully. And then guess what? Their entire career might be in jeopardy, or at least their form at the level that was expected of them. That's why it's like there's so many factors and so many things that go into that. Doing statistical analysis for baseball or any sport is always, I think, going to be a massive challenge.
And another thing with baseball is there's a lot of statistical analysis used to determine a player's value as well. Like, for example, wins above replacement. We've had that discussion before, where I'm far from a math person, and I know that while WAR can be valuable in certain aspects, it's not the end-all be-all, especially seeing that there are different ways to get that rating, because there's 3 or 4 different websites that have different ways to determine what wins above replacement equals. And
right.
That's tough for me, as math is already hard enough. And other than like quick addition, quick multiplication, or as Jethro Bodine on the Beverly Hillbillies would say, gazintas, other than that, it's very difficult to even try to fathom a lot of this stuff. There are particular statistics when I look at baseball players. Mm-hmm. Yes, there's the traditional ones, batting average, again, which doesn't tell the whole story. RBIs, which to me has always been an example of luck and fortune.
Yes.
Walks, that's maybe a sign of a good eye, but then again, it's also about what's around you. If you have a better vision, you know what pitch is in the strike zone or not. And then that can also be altered by some umpires as well, because they could see something, they have a different strike zone. There are a few advanced statistics that I'm a fan of. There's on-base percentage. How many times you get on base regardless of a walk or a sacrifice. And, sacrifice flies don't hurt your batting average. It doesn't hurt your on-base percentage. Errors are one of those things that if you get on base by an error that hurts your batting average, it doesn't really help your on-base percentage either. There's isolated power, which tells how much raw power a guy has, which is batting average subtracted from slugging percentage. And it's not really huge in the grand scheme of things, but it's something I like. I'm a big home run guy.
And actually, isolated power, Earl, you said minus batting average, right?
Yeah, slugging minus batting.
So, and there's another way that I've seen it calculated when I've been looking around, just brushing up on a few things, and it's extra bases divided by at-bats. And see, that gets involved into the whole, what you're saying before. There's, WAR was a great example. There's different methods of calculating some of those things. Are those rooted in mathematical, you have an equation, you have a variable that you define to this thing, and another way to calculate if you rearrange the variables? Or is it just some other way that, in theory, is a way to measure this, but it's a completely different number? It's not the same number. It's just how they would prefer to calculate it. It's a measure of trying to figure out that raw power. Is it a mathematical equivalence, or is it basically what I would call a value equivalence, the value in terms of what it tells you? Because if it's a value equivalence, I would say then it's objective calculation and it shouldn't be used. If they're mathematically, if the equations are the same, then I would say, okay, fine. And that's the one thing, because, and again, while I might be a mathematician, statistics type guy, I don't claim to be an expert on sabermetrics. But one of the things that I've always seen going through, all these calculations, first of all, there's a ton of different measurements that are used in sabermetrics. It's unbelievable, actually, how many different versions of different things there are. And I can understand why somebody who may not be math inclined would look through this and, their eyes would glaze over. It's a lot to go through. And then you have certain statistics, like you said, like war, that you see 3 or 4 different ways to calculate it. And coming from a person who is math inclined, that concerns me basically with what I would call the legitimacy of the calculation. Is there some real physical manifestation of what that number you get out of there means? I could choose any 2 variables that a pitcher or whoever on a baseball team might be, encountering during a game or during a season. And I could say, I'm going to divide this thing by that thing and get a number. And I'm going to say that it's a measure of their ability to hit the ball. I don't know. But again, each of these statistics, there's an origin, as I understand it, reading through here. Somebody started calculating it and started evaluating and saying, this is a good measure of how to do this. And my whole thing is, when it comes to sabermetrics, I think some of the numbers, some of the calculations are, I think, possibly useful. I think other ones are just ones that somebody kind of looked at, came up with, almost like their own personal measurements. You know how people have their own personal instincts or their own views on something. Someone's like, okay, I'm going to look at this and look at this. And it's like, I look at this number. It's like, yeah, that gives me an idea about this thing, as opposed to being like a real, honest, mathematically, statistically valid number that could be used for forecasting. Because like in business, you're not going to just use somebody's gut to forecast what you need to purchase or what your next product is going to be in business. Why should you be doing the same in baseball or any sport?
Yeah, I don't know. And there's so many other things that you can't determine. A guy might get slower as you get older. Someone's speed might decrease. As for a pitcher, their velocity might go down. Let me use more of a fastball for an example.
Okay.
Everybody has a fastball. Maybe the velocity is not the same. Some people can throw 100. Some people can throw maybe 88.
You knew where I was going. That's exactly right. Every person's measure of success, what that person can get done, is different depending upon their body structure, their strength, the size of the hand, the size of the fingers, all those little elements that play into that final speed when they threw at that time. It goes back to, there are so many little things to measure when it comes to athletics, and how a body performs during, while playing a sport, that it's almost, too much to even try to consider every little thing in order to figure out how the body's going to perform going forward. Just from one day to the next, probably a fastball, like you said, is really a great example. One person's fastball is very different than another's. The speeds will be different. Even the angles will probably be a bit different, geometrically. So it's a lot to consider.
And one thing I'm looking at, a lot of baseball players are starting to use more, is a thing called launch angle. So they've been tailoring their swings to get a better angle to get more lift on a ball to power. So as opposed to somebody who has pure power, who doesn't have to use a particular angle, who can just hit the ball to the point where the ball just flies off their bat without changing the way they swing. That's played more of a difference. There's so many.
Yeah, that's going into the physics
of it. There's a thing called spin rate that they use for curve balls and pitches and things like that.
Yeah.
And I haven't been really looking up a lot on spin rate, but you hear it all the time. Spin rate, how much the ball rotates as well. And I don't want to just say it's towards curveballs. It might be all different types of pitches, breaking balls, off-speed pitches.
Every ball spins a little bit as it's heading towards the batter. It's just a matter of, again, how much spin that affects how the ball basically performs, how it behaves as it's heading towards there. But yeah, spin ball is actually probably a good example. That rotational velocity from one player to the next can be significantly different. And it's going to affect how that ball moves. And when you're talking about the lift behind that, we're going back into physics here. They're trying to change the angle of attack, which using gravity provide more acceleration, which will increase force, the power behind what that ball is doing. And then, and hopefully it gets past the batter, or if the batter does hit it, then perhaps it will not go where they want it to. They'll hit it in the wrong portion of the bat and it will go towards left field or it'll be a foul. That's one of those other things about baseball. It's like there's actually comparatively a very narrow channel which a legal ball goes. How wide is your foul range kind of thing, It's like there's a lot of different ways that ball can go, and only a select few, whenever a ball's coming towards you, that will actually count for something, be in play, as we say.
Speaking of in play, with the variety of stadiums and different dimensions, a home run in Baltimore might not be the same as a home run in San Diego, or a home run in Los Angeles, or a home run in Yankee Stadium, or a home run in Fenway. And I like the quirkiness of different stadiums, and everything has a different look. There's no set field of play. The Polo Grounds, where the New York Giants played and the Mets played, where they would have the walls, I believe, were about 300 left and right field, and then they'd have like this huge center field, and that could range from somewhere to 470 to 483, and then it would be a down slope. So if the ball went overhead, you'd have to run downhill to catch the ball.
Yeah.
And they'd have overhanging rafters. So if you hit it a good 250 to 275 feet up into the upper level, it's going to be a home run where it wouldn't have been a home run if you hit it down the line, just, I'd say, below those seats. If you take a look at the Polo Grounds, there are probably photos on the internet of those overhanging walls. And you could just see how they're sloped and how there'd be much more of an advantage. If you lofted up high enough, it would clear and would be a home run.
Yeah, and that's one of those things that, like you said, that's one of those quirks of baseball, but that's one of those quirks that I think most people, myself included, kind of like. Each stadium is unique, and each stadium has its own quirks with what's foul, what's fair, what's a home run, basically everything from how the wind can come in and then channel or direct the ball as it's in the air. I mean, there's all sorts of factors, and that's one of those things that goes back to what we were saying earlier, trying to do statistical analysis. When you're in a baseball field, and you're trying to basically do some statistics on how that person is performing, you're assuming a number of constants. For good statistical analysis, you need there to be a number of constants in place that don't change no matter what the situation is in order for that to be at any point valid. For example, a home run percentage, or think of any sort of measurement that may involve home runs that are hit by a player. If they're always in Camden Yards, that number is going to be one thing. Let's say, we're just going to make something up. Let's say it's 10%. That's very generous, but 10%. So let's say that average person's, and how many yards, Earl, does it take for a person to get a home run in Camden Yards? Not that I expect you know off the top of your head, but what would you estimate?
Yards-wise, left field 110 yards, about right field about 100, and dead center is about divided by 3. I'm trying to pull the math off myself.
100, 110 yards. Approximately.
Yeah, worst case is 410 in center.
And there are some places that you said in which you can get a home run by going only as far as like 250 feet. Is that correct?
That was the old one in the Polo Grounds back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, early 60s. But now I think the smallest dimensions, I think Fenway's wall might be short.
Even when I was there last year with my dad, and I did notice that's like this CBC, which I could tell it was significantly small. Just like in variation from that alone, you're talking about from 300 feet to 330 feet. That's a 10% difference. And so you think about it, if somebody is trying to, get their statistics in Fenway and, they're hitting them and all that kind of thing, and then they go to, say, Camden Yards or, Yankee Stadium or name a stadium, which it's slightly different. It sounds like that, the variation can be as much as 10 or 20%, which means depending on which stadiums you're in, when you are striking the ball or when you're just, again, how the wind channels itself, weather can have a significant impact on performance that night. And it's something, again, we can't control. The field, if it's a little bit slick still after it rains, that can affect everything from catching to, if the ball might be a little bit wet because the air is moist, very humid outside, and then the composition of the ball changes. There's all these elements that, depending on where you are, what stadium you're at, can change what your statistics are that night. And then you average over the season, somebody's going to say that it's negligible, but I don't agree with that, because you're talking about variations that could be like 10, 20%. And not only is that statistically significant, that's enough so that if there was variation that much in like an actual scientific study, the results would be thrown out. There's too much variation there. That's just like, it's basically like a roll of the dice. So if you happen to be playing more in Fenway that season, or getting the majority of your home runs in Fenway that season, or most of your hits in that season, you're going to have a better chance of getting that home run possibly than you would in another stadium. So there's so much variance that it calls into question the ability to really accurately statistically measure a lot of these elements of a baseball player's performance at all.
Yeah, and we were talking about home run rates, so I just found this info. MLB Park Factors, home runs a game, Great American Park in Cincinnati, Ohio, 1.395 per game over this last season. Number 2, Coors Field in Denver, 1.28. So elevation. That's one issue. Globe Life Park in Arlington, Texas, very hot weather, 1.273. And the round out number 4 through 10. 4, Citizens Bank Park in Philadelphia, 1.19. Nationals Park, 1.173. Yankee Stadium, 1.16. Angel Stadium, Anaheim, 1.138. Now, what they say about Angel Stadium, daytime, it's easier to hit home runs. At night, it is very hard for the ball to travel.
And you know why that is?
And then Rogers Center in Toronto, Ontario, Canada, 1.125. Also a retractable roof dome, so that could also be a difference. Oriole Park at Camden Yards, number 9, 1.12. And the next one, Miller Park, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 1.116. Retractable roof dome, Midwest, northern Midwest. But some of the top stadiums for home runs per game are basically in the Mid-Atlantic or the American League East. Mid-Atlantic, Citizens Bank, Nationals Park. If you count New York State as Mid-Atlantic, it's always sort of weird how they do that. That's there. Oriole Park at Camden Yards, Mid-Atlantic. Rogers Center in Toronto, American League East.
What you were saying about Anaheim is really a great example of the statistical variance that can just occur a game, let alone an entire season. You know, just from 1 hour to the next, what happens in the performance can change during the day versus during the night. A home run that otherwise would have been, possibly would not have been at night. And at the end of the day, that's going to affect that player's statistics, which therefore, you know, if they're playing in Anaheim for whatever reason a lot that season, whether they play for Anaheim or their team is going against Anaheim, you know, a lot, and they're, you know, those days in which they're in Anaheim a lot, that's going to affect their statistics significantly. And so you got to consider some of these things. And I don't have an answer for this, but you've got to consider there almost has to be some sort of factor almost that would have to be brought in order to try to help even this out. Like, for example, if you're trying to measure on-base percentage, is the on-base, you know, if you're in Anaheim Stadium versus Yankee Stadium, if you need to multiply each by some number so that it evens out and they account for each other's stadiums and they're just weather differences.
Oh, yeah, and I understand. And I think slugging would be more an example where you'd have to worry about that. On base, I think it's all about hits. It doesn't matter if it's like a ball that barely gets out of the infield or if it's a line drive, getting on base there, but you're going to benefit from a walk on your on-base percentage. So I guess more of a physical skill. Patience and discipline, knowing when not to swing. And also an example of an umpire, whether they see a particular pitch, because the difference between a ball and a strike could be just a position of where an umpire is. And I feel like focusing those type of things, it can be a very... It feels like there's a lot of minutia when it comes to baseball.
There really is.
And things can change. And I don't want to say like a butterfly effect, but little things can change everything. A ball could slip out of your hand. A pitch could, a lot of pitches have movement when it comes to their velocity. A ball can move everywhere. You might try to aim for one spot and it just goes another direction, and it can change a lot.
Butterfly effect is a real thing. There's a mathematics called chaos theory, and that is where the butterfly effect is often talked about. And it explains how things such as clouds are formed. I mean, if you think about that, all the variation there is in the cloud, Earl, what does that mean there could be in variation in terms of how a ball travels or how a bat may, when it hits the ball, where basically how fast it goes, so thing like that. The butterfly effect is very real. And you brought up the umpire too. There's another piece that can be subjective if it's a strike or if it's a ball. As you said, there's a lot of minutia. There really is to baseball. And that makes statistical analysis of it in general very, very hard. I would almost go so far as to say that it might be very close to impossible. There are some statistics, I think, that provide value that can be measured with some relative accuracy, in which the effects of weather, Mother Nature, subjectiveness of human decisions like an umpire, are minimized. So there are statistical value to it, but beyond that, I question how much of it is just a crapshoot or is just so subjective that it's not statistically relevant.
Yeah, I think trying to, like you said before, projecting stuff, that's going to be very hard to do because there's too many things that could occur and too many factors. For example, there's a lot of stadiums. There's a few retractable roof domes. That could change everything. Big stadiums. Like, for example, you were talking about someone, if they play in Anaheim, they also have to play in Oakland, a big stadium that's huge foul ground, and a stadium whose wind pattern was changed because they had to renovate their stadium to make it football accessible. Then you have Seattle, a retractable roof dome with a huge outfield. But then you also play in Texas, where it's very hot and the ball travels. And you also play in Houston, where there's a retractable roof dome, a very hot place.
Yes.
And again, way the dimensions are, and that can change it. Just like if you say someone playing in Boston, they're going to play half their games in Boston, and then they play games in either Baltimore, New York, Toronto, Tampa Bay.
Mm-hmm.
Those are examples where it also, not even just where you play, it's, among the teams that you're going to be playing. And then I feel like it just keeps getting bigger, because then different teams have different philosophies, and that can change, and they can play roles in how you perform.
Mm-hmm. Let's just think about temperature just very quick, because temperature, most people aren't very well. A change in temperature, hot, cold, all that kind of thing. Let's say it's a very hot day in Anaheim. Okay, so somebody is prepping a ball for a pitch. Well, the temperature has changed. And let's say one day in Anaheim, it's in the 80s. And the day before when they were playing, it was in the 70s. You're talking about a 10-degree temperature difference. So that increase in temperature to the next day, when the pitcher is getting ready, his hands are probably, for example, sweatier. Okay, that means the ball on the outside is moister. Well, going a step further, so obviously that's going to affect how he releases the ball, because it's going to have a little less friction if his hands are moister, right? Even though, of course, they try to reduce that, sand it up, all that kind of thing. Guess what? Your body doesn't stop sweating, and they can only reduce it so much. But not only have the expansion and contraction of the materials involved. So the baseball is going to expand a little bit from that 10-degree temperature change. The bat is going to expand a little bit. And so not only do you have a ball whose basic structure, physical properties change, the thing you're hitting with the bat, its properties are changing. And again, is it something where, given time, weeks for that day, what those changes are? Yes. But it's highly time intensive. It's not something that gets turned around in a day or two that we can analyze those changes and analyze how it can affect performance. It's something that takes years to do. And it's something, again, it's like, how much detail do you want to get? Do you want to get down to the molecular level and show how this propagates itself? Or do you just want like a general idea? It's going to change, all will travel by about 5%. Or do you want that exact number? These temperature changes will cause a 4.678% difference in how far the ball travels. And again, but those differences are statistically significant. So something as simple as a temperature change can change how a player performs, what their numbers are like that day. And that's why I look at some of these sabermetric statistics and I'm like, is this actually useful, or is this someone's own personal number that others started using that they just kind of came up with and just kind of decided that it was good for their players, So there's a lot of variation. It's overwhelming to think about, really, to an extent.
Yeah, and I think just sort of summing things up, for me, it's hard to really project what someone will do in the future. You can go by past experience to see what they might do. Like, for example, certain guy hits better against lefties than righties. You'd use that as an advantage. Game 5 of the National League Championship Series, what happened was the Dodgers had a lineup prepared to hit against a left-handed pitcher. The left-handed pitcher started the game. After facing the first batter, the manager pulled him and brought in a right-handed pitcher for the rest of the game.
Oh, boy. So that's
to play against those odds. And they've been using different things. Like, for example, now some teams will have a relief pitcher start the game and maybe have him go an inning or two, and then bring a long relief guy who will eat up the innings. And then sometimes they'll use that reliever the next day too, that whole, as they call it now, the opener. If you look that up, Tampa Bay uses it a lot on certain days when they don't have a really good starter who will pitch the traditional way. They'll have a reliever, maybe go back-to-back, maybe 2 days in a row, start a game, maybe go an inning a third, maybe 2 innings, depending on pitch efficiency as well. And then they do that. But it seems like that's a trend that's going. And I like that. That's something different. And there's been a theory that, especially when it comes to the playoffs, you have to pitch it like you're playing in a tournament. You want to use your best guys at a particular time and not have them in a particular role.
Right. I'm just looking through here on this website about some of the other sabermetric numbers. And one of the ones, I think you mentioned it earlier, win expectancy, otherwise known as win probability. It's basically evaluating the current game situation, such as the score, the number of outs, men on base, run environment, to historical situations, and deriving a percentage that is quantifies basically the team's chance of winning, from one event in the game to the next. And I'm just looking at that, considering what we talked about, and it's like, that's, I think, it says here an example, if a team's win expectancy jumps from 30% before a home run to 70% after, the player who hit the homer would have a WPA, or a win probability added, of 0.4 for increases in his team's chances of winning by 40%. Basically what it boils down to is that this one event in a baseball game can switch, probabilities so much, to switch those statistics up and changes to, of players so much that forecasting, becomes so difficult because you can never anticipate what's going to happen from one game to the next. That's one of those actually really cool things about baseball, why I think baseball is such a great sport to watch in person, because every game is different. Every game is unique and has its own unique quirks to it. No one game is like another. And that's, part of the beauty of the game, that randomness.
Yeah, and for example, there was a game a couple of years ago, 2016. The Orioles, I think, hit back-to-back-to-back homers in a game, also the Astros, and lost the game. So their win probability went all the way up, and they still lost. Mm-hmm. And that happens a lot sometimes in different sports. I mean, it's really hard to put that on something like maybe basketball, because sometimes there are plays where it comes down to the last possession. And it's really hard to project a lot of stuff. Like, for example, fantasy football uses a lot of win probabilities. There's projections, but then again, what happens if your players are under that?
Mm-hmm. And they use sabermetrics across a number of sports now, don't they? One that comes to mind.
I don't think they're calling them sabermetrics. They're more advanced statistics. I know basketball is using advanced statistics. Hockey is definitely using it. NFL, it seems like they're avoiding it and not using it as much. Quarterback rating was also a tough thing for me to try to understand. There's just so much into that. And
there's no math in football. What are you talking about?
Yeah, only when it counts to the scores.
Right.
I feel like keeping statistics is good just to measure numbers. But I feel like trying to go ahead and project them and look forward and predict stuff is hard. People can't even predict the weather accurately. How can you predict what someone will do down the road?
You can only analyze it so much before it's overkill and it doesn't mean anything anymore. There's so much of that. Weather is really such a great example to compare it with baseball, because you think about how accurate the weather is. And again, weather is all about analyzing historical trends and making determinations about seemingly small calculations that could have butterfly effects and, cause something like a tornado, and trying to forecast when those will happen in the future. And that's very, very difficult. Something that Back to the Future 2 got wrong. They were hoping in 2015 we did have the accuracy of, knowing what the weather's going to be like from 1 minute to the next. Not even close. We still can't get the weather right sometimes a day or two in advance. Hurricanes this past season have been a great example of where they're going to hit, what the impacts are going to be. And we're talking about a massive weather system here. You would think, okay, this thing is going to go in that direction. But no, those things can take massive because of small things such as like where another storm is located or the temperature of the ocean. If those little changes can have such a big effect on something like a hurricane, can you imagine what it could do to something like a baseball pitch?
Yeah, I couldn't think of the impact that could have on it. And I guess in this situation, as we're drawing this to a little bit of close, and definitely we're going to come back and talk a little more pop culture and less about mathematics, which sometimes can make anybody's head hurt, even the people who talk about mathematics. But yeah, I think that statistics are good, but sometimes it's hard to use them as a determinant for future production and future and for it to be accurate at least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. Some statistics are more valuable than others, and you find that out over time, analysis, and all that kind of thing. And you find it out over just general accuracy. And again, is there some what I call physical manifestation of it? Is it just some number, or does it actually have, this means that this person is, say, getting on first base more? Does it mean that they're getting more runs? Does it mean that their pitching speed is higher? What is the physical form of that number?
If you ever decide to get into advanced statistics, there's plenty of teams professionally that are looking for people in their analytics departments. I don't know if that's something you'd ever want to do. The pay's probably crap, but...
Yeah, I would be wondering about pay. I'm actually curious about that. It actually wouldn't be something I think I hate doing. I'm like you. I'm wondering what the pay was like, And you got to figure people who are really good statisticians, they usually have PhDs kind of thing. So I'd hate to have a PhD in like mathematics or something and be making $50,000. Not to say $50,000 a year is bad, but I got a PhD for Pete's sakes. I think I could do a little more, right? Help me out.
I mean, eventually, if you use it to work your way up to be like a general manager or something like that, or pro baseball operations, there's plenty of people that have MBA. Other people use it to move into maybe the CFO or COO sides, as opposed to just the on-field and front office stuff.
Right. And they have to understand it at general manager. They have to understand some of those statistics. You're absolutely right. At least the most commonly used ones, they must understand them, because you think about how many millions of dollars, hell, billions of dollars are spent on a difference of 1% in baseball.
That is pretty deep.
Yeah, just one little stinking percent, which in some cases might be statistically insignificant, but in baseball, that could be home runs. We talked about home runs or batting averages. A person hits home runs 1% more than their colleague, I bet you they're going to be getting a contract.
And that could be the difference between paying for a guy who's going to be productive down the road or paying for Chris Davis, who had the statistically worst season in his career after signing a contract on a walk year. Some people have really good free agency walk years, as they call it, and end up making their money off of that and don't live up to those numbers ever again.
That's exactly right.
And then there's some people who maybe get better over time and exceed the numbers that they get. Just a little thing here, a tweak in their swing could turn somebody who is an average hitter into a monster or a Hall of Famer, especially in the post-steroid era.
Right. That's exactly right. I agree with that 100%.
As we wrap this up, I really want to thank you, and I will definitely have you back next time. We're going to go a little more pop culture game stuff. I know the math is a very tough part just for me, just trying to I understand some of this, but some of the calculations are just too out there.
When you first started talking about sabermetrics with me a few years ago, I was thinking to myself, it's like, what kind of calculations are these? They can't be that complicated. And I started looking through and I was like, these people are doing some crazy math here in a few places, I mean, at the end of the day, it's mostly to, add, subtract, multiply, divide, but these equations are pretty long in some cases. And then one of the elements then has its own equation to calculate. And it's then you have, subsets of equations. And it's somebody stayed up all night thinking of this stuff. It's, they must have had somebody that's good in math coming up with this. I was very surprised about how in-depth it got and how, dense it was. So don't feel bad.
Do you think it'd be something that you could easily get a handle on with even just a year of experience, or is it something that would take a lot more?
If you're very math oriented, you could get it within a year. You would, as a math person, you write things out, then you look at it and you look for the patterns, kind of thing. If you're in tune with math, you'll see those naturally. If you're not math in tune, it's something you may never be able to fully wrap your head around, kind of thing. So it just depends on the person and how valuable they think it is. If they really think it's valuable, they're going to, I think, put more time and invest and really study it well, just like anything.
Mark, I do appreciate it. How are some ways people can reach out to you and connect with you on different avenues?
So on Facebook, you can look me up. Earl knows you, that I know that I'm going to trust you too, right? So the last name, DeMorra. We talked about this. There's not many DeMorras out there. But otherwise, I stream on Twitch quite a bit. And I'm on Twitter a bit too. And I stream on Twitch. I like to, we talked about the game shows and all that kind of thing. We didn't talk about video games at all. We need to talk about that at some point. And maybe have a runoff on RBI baseball or something like that, so you can win. But I stream on Twitch under the name Coral Cola. So you can find me on there. Twitter, same thing, Coral Cola. It's from a video game, nerdy stuff. Otherwise, find me on Facebook. Or have Earl send me a message, right? Earl knows where to find me, right?
I think the next subject we should do, in addition to pop culture, we can talk about video games and esports, how now that's becoming classified as a thing.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Man. Some of the most popular stuff on Twitch these days are esports. Oh, my God. Madden. Madden will never go away.
Even though, despite how much people want it to go away, because it basically is a glorified roster update that people pay $60 a year for.
Yeah, that's pretty much what it is. And maybe a slight graphics update, but maybe so small you can't even see it anymore. Remember when the new Maddens were released in the 90s, the graphics were a bit better. You're like, whoa, this is the best it's ever been. These look awesome. I feel like I'm really playing it. And then now it's just looks exactly the same. You're right. The only thing that's different is the roster.
After a particular moment, it'll be great until they start focusing on the next gen. And then the next gen ones are going to get all the focus. And then the last gen ones aren't going to get anything at all.
Right. And we're moving towards, of course, everything being downloadable. So you're not going to even buy the game. They can just update rosters as they go. So they'll download it. You download the system, and then you'll update the rosters every year. Pay $10 or whatever it'll cost them, to do that. So, yeah.
I have a Madden 16, and I am not buying another game. I've got it really cheap. And I'm just waiting for somebody to take the time of their own to create the roster, and I'll just download it from there so I don't have to buy Madden 18 or Madden 19 or whatever year it is.
You got it. And don't you have some rosters from some, like, don't you have Classic O's rosters on there somewhere, or not on that?
MLB The Show 17, I believe. I got to look at it. MLB The Show, I created rosters, and I'm working on those. I haven't worked on those in a few months, but just trying to make the 1994 MLB rosters without, of course, Tampa Bay and Arizona. But those are still a work in progress. And I feel like once they're done, at least I'll have them in perpetuity. And then you can save, if you start a season with those, you can play it in any version after that. And then you can just basically upload those rosters, save it, import those players into the rosters, and then there you have them.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually, as you said, that's a labor of love there as opposed to, like anything else. It's because I got to imagine that's time consuming as all get out.
Oh, yeah, it is. I haven't even done it in months, but it's one of those things. Again, Mark, I do appreciate it, and hopefully talk to you in definitely a few weeks to talk a little more about pop culture and video gaming.
You got it. Anytime. Thank you for having me, Earl.